Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a big cardboard box misfits of every sort can hang out inside of like a clubhouse. I'm Andrew Heaton, and I am very big on free trade. Like, you know Dune? When the trade pilots say, the spice must flow. That's me, only on trade. In the next few weeks, I will likely do an episode on why trade is good, comparative advantage, and some analogies probably involving Scottish wine and anemic French sheep, something like that. The underlying mechanics that explain, hey, here's why trade's a good thing. Don't put rocks in the harbor. But today, in the wake of the election, we're going to go all nuts and bolts on this topic. A practical what can and can't the president do on trade policy? Can the president set tariffs himself? Does he have a dial on his desk where he just boop, 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 20%? Does he need Congress to formally declare war in order to spark a trade war? I think this is all very pertinent because one of the big policy objections to the forthcoming Trump administration, certainly from yours truly, has been, wait, stop, trade's good, trade war, bad. But I find myself, when engaged in these conversations, almost immediately thinking, right, but can the president actually do any of that? Does he need Congress's permission, or is this just a rhetorical grab bag, like when a candidate says, I will ban all guns or something? The president can't do that. That's Congress and the Supreme Court and all that kind of thing. So how much of trade policy is set by the president versus just the president saying what he wishes trade policy was? Today, we're not going to talk about the why of trade. We're going to talk about the what. What can the president do on trade? And I promise you, by the end of today's episode, you will have such a better grasp and understanding of how the actual levers and mechanisms of power work on this topic. You will be able to engage in this discussion and know what you're talking about because you're right here on The Political Orphanage. We are joined today by one of our own, gang. We're joined by a fellow political orphan, Big Jim, as you might know him from the Discord. The world knows him as James Thatcher, as well as the author of thetradenerd.com. He is a licensed custom broker with 22 years of experience. I don't entirely know what that means, but I do know that it roughly means that he is a trade expert and a logistics expert. And so I have coaxed Jim to coming on the program today to go past what I can do, which is explain the benefits of trade in a instructional, economic, or educational capacity, and actually talk to us in a practical sense of, yeah, okay, what happens now that Trump's coming in? So delighted to have you, Jim. Hello.
Great to be here, Andrew, as always. And to my fellow orphans, yes, you too can broadcast across the pithy airwaves that is the world of Andrew Heaton.
That's right. You can. And Jim's actually been on once previously. I believe we talked about slavery in the supply chain. Wasn't that you, Jim?
Yeah, it was slavery in the supply chain and Walmart and how Walmart practices certain things. And I had a lot of experience with that. I got a lot of good feedback from that one. So hopefully we can do some education today as well. And maybe either turn up the fear or turn down the fear, depending on who you are.
Great. What I want, Jim, is variable fear. If you are right now not afraid, I want you to be afraid. But if you are afraid, I want to comfort you. Either way, yes. I want to move the emotional needle by the end of the day. This is a good goal. I like this, Jim.
This is how we get patrons, Andrew. This is how we get the patrons.
This is how we do it. Well, okay. Then a kickoff question for you, Jim.
Sure.
I'm an unabashed free trade guy. I don't think that if somebody drops rocks in their harbor, you don't solve problems by putting rocks in your harbor. I can see situations where you might want to use tariffs as a temporary leverage, things like that. But overall, though, my goal is to get to free trade.
Yes.
Noting all of this, how much actual power does the president have over tariffs and trade? How much is Congress versus the president?
In normal trade transactions, we're speaking the normal world, it's mainly more of a congressional situation. Congress on annum will pass a trade act, or not necessarily even a trade act, but it'll be a continuation of duties and tariffs that are applied to tariff classification codes. And those usually happen once a year. Now, that being said, the president has options to maneuver additionally, to levy additional duties on these things, as well as to set certain parameters. So I want everybody to stop for a second. I'm gonna try and not necessarily make everybody a trained tariff classification expert, but I am gonna give you a little bit of a precursor, so you're kind of in the brain space for this. Imagine, if you will, a 6-digit number. It's 4 digits, dot 2 digits. That is the international tariff classification code by the Harmonized Tariff Schedule globally. That is set and created by the World Customs Organization, which is an offshoot of the World Trade Organization. So that entity gets together, and it is basically, for lack of a better word, it is a trade agreement that everybody kind of accepts who's in the WTO, accepts these WCO standard classifications. Now, there are certain countries that don't, most notably North Korea. For a very long time, Jamaica wasn't, for whatever reason, and now Jamaica's on it.
I so frequently lump those two questions together, Jamaica and North Korea. I always think of them as the same. Makes sense trade-wise.
Hey, man, I love a good jerk chicken just as much as anybody else. I don't know what that has to do with kimchi, but okay, sure, whatever. But typically, the first 6 digits are an international classification number to classify certain items that everybody can kind of agree to. Okay, this is a book. This is a flag. This is footwear, and it gets very specific when you get into certain items, right? Then from there, it is the individual country who can then take that 6-digit classification and expand it. So usually what happens is most countries tack on maybe 2 more digits, right? So you go from a 6-digit classification to an 8-digit classification. That's pretty normal because you're trying to track certain things. In the United States and in Canada, it goes to a 10-digit classification because we like to be more granular. That's fine. The French go to 12. Do I need to explain anything more about the French in that manner? No, I don't think I do.
Although it does sound like we're more metric than them when it comes to our trade classifications. So take that, France.
I'm just saying it's possible that France reads into redundancy upon redundancy. But to my French friends, pardon. Anyway, moving on. The president then doesn't necessarily set any of that. That is all established by congressional action. If it's past the 6 digits, and if it's the 6 digits or before, that's international action.
So this is more than I've previously learned, but I want to make sure I'm following this far. So this offshoot of the World Trade Organization that has the designations for tariffs will go theoretically 44984 is shoes, and 0.32 is sandals, and 0.33 is stilettos or something like that. So that's all established by this international body. Where we come in as we go, well, we're actually going to separate sandals into hot, strappy sandals versus Jesus sandals versus something else. Like there's a certain level of, we all agree they're sandals, but we can make further delineations therein. We're doing that on our end. Is this more or less correct? Okay.
Correct. So, and for those other trade nerds that are on the phone, yes, I know sandals fall under Chapter 64. Let's not get into it.
We all do. Anyway. I don't want any more emails about how sandals fall under Chapter 64, gang. We're operating at 201, not 101. Let's keep going.
All right. So anything that is 6 digits or before, anything that is after the 6 digits. Now, Andrew, as you've worked in a congressional office, you're very much aware that there are various different interested groups that might be interested in knowing, hey, how much of a certain type of brake pad are we bringing in, or how much of a certain type of honey are we importing? That's where we get those statistical information points. So when you hear somebody on the news say, last year, we imported from Japan 50 million cars, as an example, nobody is sitting at the ports with a pair of binoculars counting every single car that comes off of a boat. We're taking that data from statistical information that is filed with U.S. Customs. And that statistical information then comes from the tariff, so we can dig down and get that information further set up. So that being said, this is all the normal process. As you're classifying, there are two specific columns. There's column 1, and then technically there's 3. There's column 1, there's column 2, and in between columns 1 and 2, you have the special duty column. Okay. We'll talk about the specials in just a second. Column 1 is the nice guy column, the most favored nation status column. These are a highly reduced amount of duty that is used for specific countries. So our friends, basically people we're in alliances with, so on and so forth. Column 2 used to be called the communist column. So that's all that in that column, that's where we have all the bad people like North Korea, Iran, blah, blah, blah. Even though you can't legally import from those countries, if you could, they would be in column 2. The special column is where you look at and you find the free trade agreements and or duty reductive agreements. So you can have specials in there. So one of the things the president can do, while these are set by Congress, one of the things the president can do very quickly is say, for example, China, we're no longer going to treat you as a most favored nation. As such, anything that's in column 1 would immediately move on a set date to column 2. You would be taking an item. So let's just use an example. You would take, let's say an automobile, which is normally 4 to 4.5% duty, depending on type of automobile, blah, blah, blah. 4.5% duty in column 1 would shoot up to 26.5% duty in column 2. So it's an immediate, fast movement. Okay. President Trump in his previous administration didn't do this because he was using Section 301, which is a national security section, to try and leverage China to kind of change their ways. He's using that.
So can I pause you because I want to get into what he did previously. So I'm going to hold back on that for a moment to make sure that I understand you this far. So Congress is the one that actually sets the rate on tariffs. We've decided that we're importing sandals. There's a 10% tariff on all sandals brought into the country. However, we're going to have a delineation between Group A, or the third column, which is people
column
that are
1 and column 2. Yep.
There's if you're in a free trade network with us, like NAFTA, there's nothing.
Yes.
Or like within the United States, there's nothing.
Correct.
If you're a most favored nation, which would be everybody in the WTO, you're in this low tariff thing, and then there's an enemies column. So the president does not set the rates, but the president does get to pick where your country qualifies. So Congress, if it sets column 2 for the baddies at 26%, as you bring up, what Trump has the ability to do is go, you know what, China's no longer our friend. We're no longer going to have most favored nation status with it. I'm putting it in the bad column, which means that he can automatically jump it to whatever Congress has previously set at the we don't like you rate.
Correct. That's correct.
That's super helpful.
There are, with most favored nation, though, there's a lot of things that go along with that, right? A lot of that is banking and financing. So the minute you cut off most favored nation status, it's not just a tariff delineation. There are lots of other things that come along with that, which is probably why he didn't do that initially. He wanted to kind of beat them with a stick, but not like completely pulverize them in that aspect, right? So that's one action he can take without congressional approval. There's a bunch of more other actions. So one of them is he can institute under the 1917 Trading with the Enemies Act, which is only supposed to be used in time of war. He can completely immediately reset trading and tariff rates and surpass Congress. But that's at a time of war. So the question
your
becomes,
definition of war and my definition of war might vary. Like I would say we've been at war for 20, 30 years now, depending on the theater. Or alternately, we've not been at war since Korea, if you want to be really legal about it. We've only had temporary conflicts and authorizations of military. We haven't actually declared war since Korea.
So war-wise, if it's the Enemies Act, you have to have a declared war against the country that you're changing the tariffs for. So we would have to declare a type of war, and let's just use China because they're the scapegoat, unfortunately, at this point. If we were going to declare a war against China, at that point he can immediately bypass Congress and say, okay, based on the 1917 Trading with the Enemies Act, I'm going to set all of the duty rates out of China at 150%, and he can do that based on that act. However, it has to be a war. And so it would have to be a declaration of war, which goes through a whole nother synopsis, which does have to go through
I will add,
Congress.
if we literally go to war with China, I will be dead because I'm going to be living in the DC area and I will be nuked, as will a lot of Americans. So, like, if we actually go to war with China, I will no longer care about tariffs nearly as much as I currently do.
I will be also with you because I live in Dayton, Ohio, and we're number 5 on the hit list. So
Yeah.
yes, I'm right next to you, Andrew. We'll be toasting this in heaven.
Okay, wait. So let me pause you one more time before we move forward here with the most
Sure.
favored nation status. It is my understanding with the World Trade Organization that we've basically entered a trade alliance with a bunch of countries, and we've said, look, we're all going to say, if you're a member of the WTO, we're all going to treat each other equally in terms of tariffs. So the United States, I might have a 10% top hat tariff that I apply to most favored nations. But what it does mean is I can still have tariffs and I can set them at whatever I want. What I can't do is pick favorites anymore. If you're in the WTO, and we love the French this week and we hate Belgium this week. Both of you were WTO members. I can only do 10% tariffs on top hats. I can increase it, but I have to increase it on both of you. I don't get to pick and choose.
You have to increase it the whole way across.
Right.
Exactly. Now, here's the thing with China specifically. China is not a full member of the WTO. They're a provisional member.
Wait, what?
They're
Okay,
a
that was what I was about to
provisional
ask, because I was like, why can he tinker with any of this? If they're WTO members, then they're automatically most favored nation. They're not full members of the WTO.
They're a
really?
provisional member now, as of the time of this recording, and to my knowledge, at the time of this recording, they're a provisional member of the WTO. They are not a full-fledged member of the WTO. But he can do other things. There are other things that the administration can do. So, for example, we've talked about
wait. So with the provisional member, though, does that mean that he can unilaterally take them out of most favored nation status?
Yes.
So, like, we couldn't do that with a full member of the WTO. We couldn't take
Correct.
Belgium and say,
we
unless we
take
declared
Mexico,
war on them.
We couldn't take Mexico. We couldn't take Canada. We couldn't take Belgium. We couldn't take Poland, for example.
These are most of the
countries
OECD or pretty much
Yes.
all of Europe. But China, I did not know this. China is a provisional member, and therefore we can adjust our individual relationship with them in terms of tariffs and trade.
Correct. Now, again, that's as of my knowledge as of this time. So I might be wrong on that, and I'm sure we'll hear about it if I am, but that's to my knowledge. A couple other things he can do. The 1930 Act, Tariff Act, Section 338, he can levy up to a 50% additional tax and or fee, depending on how it's written, to just against anybody who discriminates U.S. commerce, including banning imports as well as a third country provision. So one of the things that comes up with regard to that is we've heard a lot of, hey, you've got all these Chinese investments in Mexico building automobiles, and they're trying to shove them into the United States. Chinese, now, they might be a Chinese manufacturer, but it's in Mexico. So the country of origin of the goods is Mexico. The country of export of the goods is Mexico. So it's really comes down to under Section 338, he could say, well, okay, but we're doing a ban and or imposing this additional tax or fee on items coming out of Mexico that have Chinese origin behind it. And he can do that through Section 338.
Really?
That does not directly require much with regard to that, except maybe an investigation by the International Trade Group. The international,
that's
international
interesting
trade,
to me as well, because it's my understanding that with the WTO, there are provisions in it where if you're forming the name is escaping me here, but if you're forming a free trade zone like the European Union, or like NAFTA before NAFTA was taken out, that's okay. So like you don't, at that point, you get to have, if you're in a free trade zone, you can have zero tariffs. And I did not realize that. So even in that situation,
we have to be careful here when it comes to the wording of free trade zone. Okay.
Okay.
So there is foreign trade zone and there's a free trade zone, and a free trade zone is different. So what a free trade zone basically means is a free trade zone would be like maquiladoras in Mexico. Okay. So you can import anything you want into these maquiladoras, pay no tax, pay no duty, as long as those goods are then exported out of the country of Mexico. That's how that provision is sent. In the United States, we don't have free trade zones. We have foreign trade zones. Completely different vernacular, but it operates a little bit differently. When you're talking about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that's a trade agreement. That's not
Thank you.
a
Trade agreement.
zone.
Yes. Right.
Right.
Yes.
So in the European, it's called the European Trade Zone Agreement. So the EUTFA, European Union Free Trade Agreement Zone, or whatever they're calling it, but it's the Eurozone. Like we all know it as the Eurozone.
Right. Yeah.
And in the Eurozone, that's based off of the trade agreement that you can move these goods around within that trade agreement. Now, at any time, anybody could say, hey, I don't like this trade agreement anymore and pull out, which is what Trump did with NAFTA. Trump pulled out of NAFTA, but put us into the USMCA, which is the US, Mexico, Canada agreement. That basically replaced NAFTA, for lack of a better word. There was a lot of other provisional changes that went into it specifically for automotive, but that basically, USMCA basically replaced NAFTA.
Right.
So in that essence, yes, but he can do a third-party ban because it is discriminating and threatening U.S. commerce and U.S. manufacturing.
Theoretically,
commerce.
and I know next to nothing about the USMCA that you just alluded to. I was familiar with NAFTA. Theoretically, if NAFTA still existed, we couldn't put tariffs on Mexican goods, but under the provisions that you're describing, if China opened up, like if China built an orange plantation in the Yucatan and it was all owned by Chinese business and they were using it to sell oranges to the United States, the president would have the ability to go, look, I'm not putting tariffs or penalties on Mexico. We are being Trojan horsed by the Chinese through Mexico, and I have the legal ability to target their goods when they come through that back door. So that's something the president can do. Okay.
Correct. Especially if they're utilizing a maquiladora in Mexico, where the goods never really, while they're made in Mexico, they weren't really entering the commerce of Mexico. So you could ship all of your Chinese parts into a maquiladora, build something there, and then try and claim it as country of origin Mexico. It wouldn't work, but you could try to do that.
Wait, is a maquiladora like when I buy cigars at the airport? Like, is it?
No.
Okay, all right. So it's
that's a whole nother thing. That's a duty-free store. That's a whole nother variant we'll get into.
Okay. Wait, so with a maquiladora, though, with a free trade zone, using your terminology, and I appreciate establishing the lexicon here.
Yep.
Excuse me, that's a foreign trade zone. It sounds to me like it's lily padding. Where
foreign trade zones in the U.S., free trade zone could be other areas, but foreign trade zone is the legal definition in the United States if you were to create one in the U.S.
And so that would kind of be like if you're just stopping over in an American port before it gets somewhere else, we're not going to put tariffs on you. So if we're bringing in stuff from Japan, it's going to stop in Hawaii, and it's going from Hawaii to Brazil. We're not going to put tariffs on you at this particular foreign trade zone thing.
That's not even a foreign trade zone. So now we're really getting into the rabbit hole. So let me explain that one real quick.
All right.
That is what's called a bonded area. So it's never going to enter the commerce of the United States. It comes into a bonded area. It's held there, and then it moves on. So we would do what's called a transportation and export bond, T&E bond. Or it might be what we also call, let's say the boat is just stopping in Hawaii, and then it's going to veer south and go to, like, say, Argentina. Mm-hmm. That's an immediate export bond. So there's different types of bonded material that comes through there. What a foreign trade zone is, and this used to be very prevalent in the U.S. automotive manufacturing community, you would have these manufacturing plants that were built and set up as a foreign trade zone. So they could bring in parts from all over the world, not pay any duty on them, put American labor behind it, put American know-how behind it. And as long as it met the legal requirements for the amount of goods in there being of U.S. origin, it could then exit the foreign trade zone as a U.S. vehicle and not pay.
This is really helpful. Okay, so
all.
I'm going to make sure I'm understanding this for everybody. You're getting this is Jim. Thank you so much. We're all getting an education in this. Everybody listening to this program is going to be light years ahead of everybody else in the country in terms of basic trade stuff. This is awesome. Thank you. All right. So theoretically,
confusing, but trust me, this is why you hire people like me.
So let's say theoretically there are no foreign trade zones in the United States. I am a South Korean. Company, Mazda, maybe. I can't remember if they're Japanese. Let's just say they're South Korean.
Let's use Daewoo. Daewoo's
Daewoo, yeah,
definitely
okay,
a
I'm
green
Daewoo. If we don't have any of these zones, and I open up
Sure.
a company, a factory in Mississippi,
Mhm.
that's okay.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
under normal circumstances, I am now going to have to pay duties and tariffs on all of the lug nuts that I bring in from other places in order to
Correct.
build my stuff. So if I'm bringing in
Correct.
spark plugs from Argentina and I'm bringing in rubber from Panama, I'm paying tariffs on all of those. What we do with foreign trade zones is we're basically going, look, because you're employing American workers, we're going to kind of exempt you from these tariffs here. So you can open up a factory on American soil, and provided that you're obliging American laws and regulations, and the majority of the workforce is going to be American, we will exempt you from tariffs that are part of this intermediate supply process. Something like that?
Up to a certain point, yes. Up to a certain point. There are certain things that you cannot do that with. There are certain things that we call zone restricted, and you can't,
right.
You still have to pay the duty.
You can't get like the whole car shipped over from South Korea, then have a guy in Utah put a steering wheel on it and go, yay, we did it. Like stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Right. Well, it's not just that, but there's other specific items. So certain types of steel, you can't just willy-nilly bring it in because we're trying to maintain the U.S. steel infrastructure. That's an example. So another example of this would be I had a customer in the Midwest who imported large fan units, very expensive fan units that you would see. And they would bring in the blades from one country. They would bring in the motor from China. They would bring in the electronical components from Japan, et cetera, et cetera. Well, individually, all these things had multiple different tariffs, and it was very expensive. But they brought them into a foreign trade zone, and we did kitting. So you had somebody in a warehouse basically kitting all these things together, putting it all together. Well, the duty rate on a completed ceiling fan is 0. So they were bringing all these things in. We were able to reduce the duty down to 0 and move it out of their facility with no additional payment to the U.S. Customs Service or U.S. Customs and Border Protection, excuse me. So that's another one. There's a couple other trade things that Trump can do if we want to get back to that, or we can keep talking about trade.
Yeah. No, let's get back to that. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So we covered Section 338. We can talk about Section 232. That's going on right now. We're seeing a lot of Section 232, specifically with steel. And that's not just China, but China's the big one right now when it comes to steel. The president has the ability to create additional fees and quota specifically. Now, this is the important part, create quota on products coming in. So he can say, we're only going to accept amount up to X amount before we're just completely not bringing in this country's product anymore. We're no longer going to bring in Chinese steel, as an example.
And this is under, provision 302. Was that the operative language there?
No, this is Section 232.
Section 232.
And it's covered in the Trade Act of 1930. A lot of this comes back to the Trade Act of 1930.
And that wouldn't be Smoot-Hawley, would it? No.
That would be Smoot-Hawley.
God, all right.
That would be Smoot-Hawley.
Glad we kept that abomination on the books.
That would be Smoot-Hawley.
I spit on you, Smoot-Hawley. Okay, wait. So the president has been empowered by Congress via Smoot-Hawley to set quotas. So Congress could say theoretically, most favored nation.
This is only for national security issues. This is only for national security. So again, what is considered national security? No, it's just national security. So what is considered national security? It's very gray very quickly.
Yeah, to bring it back to our French friends, one of the provisions that happens in the Eurozone is it is a very big free trade network. I think probably the largest free trade network because it's larger than the United States. So you're not allowed to have
it's one of the biggest
tariffs and duties between Belgium and France. There is a provision within the European Union that allows you to exempt certain products that you believe are pertinent to your country's military infrastructure. The idea being that we want to maintain all the stuff about steel and whatnot. And fucking France will like exempt sponges. Like just it's just they'll find all these different ways to go. Well, technically, if you think about it, we would be drinking tea. So the teas that we have that we grow in Breton, they are part of the defense infrastructure. So national security becomes a really, really slippery way to backdoor tariffs, in my experience. And there's apparently a provision under Smoot-Hawley that if the president says this is a national security issue, can he then unilaterally impose quotas, if he says, look, lug nuts are a national security issue because we use lug nuts on tanks, therefore I don't need to consult Congress. I'm just going to say we're only going to accept 40,000 lug nuts from China this year.
So he can't do it directly. There has to be an investigation that has to be done
Okay.
through the ITC. And that's a part of the Department of Commerce. Everybody always likes to say, we're going to get rid of the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce actually does do a lot of this stuff, this back end stuff that nobody really wants to talk about. They're not just out there promoting U.S. commerce wherever they go. They're actually protecting it as well. So there has to be an investigation done. And the same is true with the Section 301 tariffs, which actually is from the 1974 Trade Act. I thought it was part of Smoot-Hawley, but it's not. It's part of the 1974 Trade Act. But the 301 is what we had with China, where we had certain items have a 25% tariff. Like, for example, hats, anything made of leather has an additional 25% on it. Certain wood products have an additional 25%, and that's above their current most favored nation rate. So if it's 5% on, let's say, a certain type of hat, you're now at 30% on hats. Why do we have 30% on hats? I don't know. That's just what they chose.
Wait. You've lost me here. So that's beyond the most favored nation. Is this because you're not in the most favored nation status? This is the baddie category of your commies, so we're putting on 26%? Or is this a national security thing where leather hats are part of our national security apparatus?
So what he is claiming is that what he claimed in his first administration was that, and this is through Navarro. So if you know who I'm talking about in the grand scheme of things, Navarro is a very interesting character. Saying that very politically correct. The push was, we'll keep them in the most favored nation status because we don't want to have any financial implication from it. But what we'll do is we'll claim it is a national security issue with regard to our intellectual property, that we are going to leverage additional duties or additional fees of 301 on top. So
got it. Okay, so it's not a tariff. It's a fee we're leveraging in order to protect IP for national security. Okay.
Correct. So what they did was they started out with certain categories and immediately put 25% on them. Why were hats included in 25%? I have no idea. Chapter 65. I have no idea why they put hats in there, but they did.
I mean, if I'm relying on my French brothers here, somebody's buddies with a dude that owns a hat factory. That's
apparently there's a bunch of haberdashers. I don't know how else to make
how exemptions to trade tend to work in my experience.
Right. So what happens then is it's the 5% would be the normal duty tariff, right? And then you would have the 25% fee on top of it. So effectively, it's a total 30% tariff on goods coming in, but it's not 30% of duties. It's just, that's why when we get into the word duty versus the word tariff, it gets really mucky real quick. You got to be careful with the definition of that.
And then look, I'm going to do a quick synopsis of what we've covered so far, because I want to make sure I understand this.
Sure.
The president has the ability to unilaterally change the status of a country from most favored nation, where they get the buddy rate along with everybody else, to the baddie category. The president can do that. It does not require congressional authorization. Congress sets the rates for the baddies. Congress sets the rates for the buddies, but the president gets to pick which category you're in. So the president can do that.
Correct. Again, WTO status matters there, though. Yes. WTO status matters there.
But the whale is China, and apparently China is a provisional member, which is really helpful for me to know. Next thing is, we can't jack up tariffs on anybody that's most favored nation, nor can we do it with anybody that's in a trade agreement like Mexico. However, we do have a backdoor recourse to target unfair products that are coming in through those countries from another country, meaning that Trump could put on tariffs to specific products in Mexico that he attributes to China or somebody else that's unfair.
Correct.
And then there's now this kind of national security / duties element that you brought up with Navarro. Is that something where the president can do it pending an investigation?
It has to be reviewed in an investigation done by the Department of Commerce. Yes.
Right. Okay. Is that a situation where Commerce just is it like the House of Lords where Commerce gets to go? We don't think you should do this, but as long as they've given their input, he can do it anyway. Or do they have to sign off on it?
They so technically, remember, the Department of Commerce reports to the president.
Right.
So if there's a thumb on the department,
So if Navarro is the head of the Department of Commerce, he will probably be able to direct them.
correct. Now that being said, remember that it gets really mucky really quick when we look at these things because there are other things that can happen too. You've got, for example, Section 201 of the Act, which also of 19 again, I'm back in 1974. That also goes to setting tariff and quota, right? So that goes into it as well when it comes to threatening U.S. industry. We haven't pulled out Section 201 specifically in this fight, but we are using Section 201 for certain other countries when it comes to national imports threatening U.S. commerce. That is also an area where we get into anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which that's kind of a whole nother bucket. But the way in the quickest synopsis I can, anti-dumping duties is when you have a company or a country that is dumping goods into the United States at below cost value to try and drive out U.S. business,
Right.
drive out U.S. Manufacturing. So a good example of this that I can come to is the furniture area. Wooden bedroom furniture for the longest time has had anti-dumping duties on it because China and Vietnam and a couple other countries basically are flooding the U.S. market with their goods to try in an effort to suppress, in some
Right.
ways, the U.S. manufacturing base. Now, what happens is there's investigations that have to go on. You have to look into each individual country, and it may not even be necessarily that there is they can still come in and undercut the U.S. cost. That's fine.
Right.
What they can't do is come in and undercut the geographical region cost. So let's say in China, for example, in China, I was going to import a bed, and the bed, they're going to sell me a bed for $50. But when you look at the geographical area, the Asian geographical area, the cost of that bed should be $65, $70 for the same bed. Well, okay, they're dumping then. So we need to raise that rate up to the $65 or $70. Even though in the US, if you made a US made bed, it might be $100. But you
Right.
have to bring it up to the area
So
rate.
basically,
coming
they're allowed to compete on cost. What they're not allowed to do is have their taxpayers subsidize the cost in order
Correct.
to undercut our manufacturers so much that we go out of business, and then presumably at some point in the future they raise costs up to regular levels. That's the anti-dumping provision.
Well, that's technically what you just described was countervailing duties. Anti-dumping is when it is no government involvement whatsoever. So
Oh, okay.
government
Okay,
involvement
yeah.
is countervailing,
Like
non-government
what
involvement
everybody
is
accuses
anti-dumping.
Walmart of doing, where they're like, they're driving down costs, but they're going to jack it up again as soon as
Yeah.
Target goes under.
Yes, that's exactly what happens.
Okay.
So, for example, in Germany has a very well subsidized steel industry. If you bring in German steel into the United States, most likely it has countervailing duties on it, not because that they're so low cost, but mainly because the German government is giving incentives to not only produce the steel, but then turn around and export the steel out of Germany. So because they're giving an incentive, they're giving I don't want to say a kickback, but they're giving funding back to these manufacturers, these mills. There is countervailing duties because it is state sponsored.
So, granted, I'm getting into the realm of economic argumentation rather than trade specifics
Sure.
here. In
Sure.
the case of Germany, we're probably not going to go to war with Germany for another 30, 40 years. We've earned a
No.
bit of a spell with them, right? So, like, we're buddies with Germany right now. If the German government wants to subsidize German steel, that sounds to me like German taxpayers are paying for my steel. If I'm importing it, like, thanks, Germany. Thanks for bilking your own
Yes,
people to pay for
but-
your product so that I get cheaper stuff. Like, all right,
Right.
sounds good to me.
But the problem then becomes you're driving U.S. manufacturers of steel out because you're
Mm.
pushing them out of that competition. So
Right.
that's where this all comes from. You can have anti-dumping duties of 0%. In fact, I've seen it. Anti-dumping duties of 0%, but because there is a effect on the U.S. manufacturing base, they're still going to put those on there when they do the investigation. They say, yeah, there's dumping here, but it's within region rate, so we can't really do anything, but we'll slap a zero on there so it makes it even harder for that importer to bring stuff in, because it's additional paperwork. It's a whole lot of additional work when you're trying to bring in something with anti-dumping and countervailing duties than it is just regular material. So there's a lot more paperwork. It's a lot more selective when you're bringing things in, and it's a lot more closely regulated.
With the duties that we're mentioning, that or the duties and penalties, and I realize there's a difference between duties and
Sure.
fees, but
Duties, penalties, fees, taxes, yes,
yeah,
all kind
but
of
with
different
all of these
vernacular.
things that are not legally tariffs, it sounds
Mhm.
like the president has a lot of latitude. It sounds like the
Yes,
president
absolutely.
cannot adjust tariff rates, but the president, direct the Department of Commerce to investigate China in terms of affecting national security via IP law and leather hats. And
Yes,
surprise, surprise, my Secretary of Commerce goes, you know what? Leather hats are in fact important. We've decided to the supply
national
chain.
security.
Yep. If we ever get a cavalry back, we're going to need them leather hats. So I, as the president, at that point, I cannot add it. I cannot make a tariff. But what I can do is add a 20% duty on top of the tariff, which
Correct.
we're being entirely terminological here. The money is the same. Where you're paying it. You're in effect you're paying a tax. Part of the tax is a tariff. Part of the tax is a duty. It's a sales tax. It's just a sales tax by that. But the
At the
president
end
does
of
have
the
the
day,
ability
the
to do that.
consumer at the end of the day, the consumer will feel the pinch, regardless of what people say. Oh no, they don't feel the pinch because these other countries are going to subsidize it. Never works. It never
No,
happens. The consumer,
that's
at
like
the end of the day,
when you
always
raise
feels the pinch.
tax rates on corporations and you go, well, that settled that. All of the CEOs are going to take a pay cut. They would never pass those on to the consumer. If we increase corporate taxes by 10%, that's that. No corporation anywhere in the world will go, well, we're just going to increase the price of our goods by 10% because we don't want to take a pay cut. Same thing.
Exactly.
Like the Chinese or whoever are like, occasionally it might do that for competitive reasons, but for the most part, though, they're going to go, well, that's just another cost of business, as if the cost of lug nuts went up. Now the cost of selling lug nuts went up, so we're going to increase that. But the president does have a lot of latitude there.
That's right. But the other thing to remember is that it's not it's what I want listeners to understand more than anything else is, when you're dealing with trade, okay, I always like to say, when we're talking about the supply chain, the physical infrastructure of the supply chain, it's held together with baling wire and chewing gum. Okay. So if a strike happens on the US East Coast, which could happen in January, that will predominantly affect the entire supply chain. That's a physical infrastructure. But when we're talking about sourcing materials and we're looking at these trade exemptions and these classification changes and all of these other fees and things that could go into place, it is not myopic, where it's not just US and China hitting heads, right? You could take, and there were several companies. I worked for a company that literally took a ton of material out of China manufacturing and moved it to places like Cambodia, that moved it to places like Bangladesh, that moved it to places like the Philippines, because we could. Now, there's still a lot of infrastructure in China where we couldn't move everything out, right? There's still a lot of predominantly strong businesses that are built in China. So, for example, if we want to talk about production of cell phones, there's a lot of rare earth minerals that are in China that are required for cell phones. You have to make them either in China or you have to make them with somebody that's buddy buddy with China if you want to get those rare earth minerals out of China. And so it's not just a myopic, well, it's just the US versus China and that's just how it is and it sucks. No, these companies, trust me, if they can find a way to move it to someplace else with avoiding this, that's going to be the first course of business is, can they do it? Because the last thing you need is somebody else coming in and undercutting you because they've already moved their production out of China and you haven't. So then a whole big realm of trade moves into aspect with competition.
Well, I have. Oh, sorry. Yeah, continue.
But remember, it doesn't work for everything. So that was my big point is there's a lot of things you can do that with, but there's a lot of things you can't, and it just depends on the product and the good.
Well, I have boundless faith in corporations trying to save costs. Like I have no doubt that they will do that, and that if Trump goes, they're not tariffs, they're not tariffs, they're not tariffs, but we are adding a 20% national security fee to imported goods from China on leather hats or whatever, I have no doubt that corporations will go, all right, well, we're gonna pick up and go to Cambodia. But if I'm not mistaken, in the preceding election, Trump regularly said that he wanted to do 10% across the board tariffs, sometimes 20% across the board tariffs. So he is looking to do a big national sales tax on everything, right? In which case, it wouldn't matter if I'm going from China to Cambodia if it's affecting everybody.
So I got a list from another podcast that gave me the list of all the things that he's threatened. 60% duty rate with China, a 10 to 20% additional duty or an increase of 10 to 20% on other countries. Now, if it's 10 to 20% on other countries, that means you're changing the column 1 tariff rate, which means he's going to have to get it through Congress.
That is Congress, because that's a big
wicket. Right. Okay. Potentially removing China from most favored nation status. We talked about that. A potential 100% duty on any country that leaves the US dollar. So that's an interesting one. I don't know how they would do that, but because the US dollar is usually the currency, the reserve currency for lots of countries, I don't know how that would be done, but that's been bandied about. A 25 to 75% additional duty and or fee on Mexico for the illegal trade and immigration that's currently occurring at the border. That you could get through with Section 301 for a national security risk. He could easily call illegal immigration a national security risk. I could see that potentially happening. And then a potential 100 to 2,000% additional duty on vehicles made in Mexico. Now, I would assume that is specifically to Chinese influence and Chinese money going into Mexico, which, again, we've kind of talked about that within the Section 338. But it could also be he looks at it and says, you know what, we're going to leverage anti-dumping. We're going to push for anti-dumping with Mexican-made vehicles in general and try and get that to 100%. Those are the things he's threatened right now, or he has threatened in the past, let's say the past 6 to 8 months. Could it happen? Sure. A lot of these could happen. Will it require a long period of time? Yes. There will need to be investigations. Anything that has to go through Congress, that's going to be really good luck with that. Especially with our Congress, even if it is majority Republican the whole way through Congress, it's going to be really hard to get everybody to agree on any number there at all.
Okay, so far, just so I'm making sure. I apologies. I want to make sure I understand this. So it sounds like when Trump threatens we're going to do a 10% overall tariff, that's not something that Trump could do. Congress could. He might be able to get the Republicans to do it. It's unlikely because there's going to be enough. There's, I think, enough free trade Republicans left that would go, we're not doing a 10% across the board tariff. So that's unlikely.
I don't think there's any way that he could bandy about and say, we're going to put a 10 to 20% duty on everything coming in, the additional duty coming on everything coming in the United States via national security, or, I mean, unless he wants to declare war on the world, which who knows?
So that seems unlikely, but what does sound likely is that he could target countries like China and Mexico and put on like an additional 20 to 40% on them specifically.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
All right.
He very easily could do that. Very easily.
Okay.
Now, the only other thing that I would say is, so I've given you all the bad news, right? If you're a free trade person, you're looking at this and you're pulling your hair out and you're saying, this is all terrible, this is horrible. Here's the good news. Most of this he can't do right away. Most of this is going to have to be either an act of Congress, he's going to have somebody in the Department of Commerce go through, and when they do these investigations, they are very, very, very thorough, because guess what happens? These countries will then sue the U.S. federal government in U.S. court if they feel that there's not due process been done. And it's been done before. Specifically, I know for several reasons, Vietnam has done this against U.S. and U.S. Court of International Trade and won. So it's going to be very difficult for them to just unilaterally do these things unless, again, most favored nation status with China. That's probably the easiest thing he could do, but it would also be the most damaging thing he could do right away.
Am I right in thinking, Jim, that when Trump was previously president, we didn't, I guess we did increase tariffs under him, but with China specifically, he levied penalties on China And
Correct.
I think they contested them with the WTO, maybe with
They
us,
did.
but he did manage to get through those duties. Did that end up getting settled? What ended up happening there? Because it sounds like that has previously happened.
So what happened with that is the way the WTO works is they'll let you do a tit for tat. So if we do something and China doesn't like it and they take it to the WTO and the WTO does their investigation, they say, you know what, US, you shouldn't be doing that, change it. And the US says, nah, screw you, we're not going to do that. Then the WTO can then go to the country that's affected and say, you know what, go ahead, increase your duty rate on something else to be of equivalent portion. So
Right.
what they did was they went after our agriculture. China went after our ag, which is our biggest export. This country's biggest export, quite honestly, is agriculture. It's one of the most
Really? Huh.
strongest exports that we have in this country is agriculture. It's one of the most dynamic exports that we have in this country. Yes, we have oil. Yes, we have natural gas. Yes, we have some other things. But for the most part, the biggest export that we have that affects the most people is our agriculture.
Okay. And so did they end up getting that done? Like, are we now in an agricultural trade war with China as a result of this?
It's our increase in this I think some of it in the Biden administration went away. I think a lot of it was smoothed over, but very realistically, it could come back very quickly. That is not, and when I say really quickly, I'm saying it's going to take a year. I'm not
Okay.
saying it's going to happen tomorrow. It's going to take time.
So
But
you could go ahead and like don't worry about Christmas shopping. Like you'll be okay there.
I think there are many reasons to be worried about Christmas shopping this year. This is not one of them.
Okay.
Uh, Next year, different story. But this year, you should be fine. But there are many other reasons to be worried about Christmas shopping this year than that.
So previously Trump did not raise tariffs on China specifically, but he did impose
Mhm.
duties through some of the strategies that you've mentioned. He
Correct.
imposed penalties on China that were in effect the same thing.
Yes.
With Trump coming in, how does it look different, if at all, than previously? Is it just a continuation of the previous Trump administration, or is he looking to do different things qualitatively or quantitatively?
So again, I'm not a Trump soothsayer, so I can't read the future. I have yet to see any of his prospective appointments for any of the trade related areas. As of the time of this recording, I think we just got the a potential name for the head of the EPA, but I do not have
Hulk
at
Hogan?
this. No, it was some senator. I can't even remember who it was. I've heard the name before, but it's not like one of the top ones that jumps off the top of my head. Um, I think, I think what we need to do is watch who is being named to these key positions, specifically Department of Commerce, specifically the Department of Justice, which obviously the Attorney General is always a big one that everybody watches for multiple
Yeah.
different reasons. Department of Homeland Security is going to be important. But I do want to say this because a lot of people like to, well, this is all customs fault, et cetera, et cetera. Customs is just enforcing the law. If there's a law in the books, customs has to enforce it. It's like a police officer. He just has to enforce the law. They're not making the law. They just have to enforce the law. So I wouldn't put any negativity on whoever gets appointed to DHS, but it's going to be an interesting tell because that'll show how aggressive the administration wants to be on certain issues with regard to trade. And then it gets back to finance. It gets back to the Congress as well. Who's heading up Ways and Means? Who's heading up Senate Finance? Who's
Right.
setting up House Finance and Control? Those positions are key and vital when it comes to specifically trade acts and the tariff itself.
We'll wrap up here in a minute, Jim. You actually work in the trade industry.
Yes.
I merely talk about it and then start like making metaphors about comparative advantage and mumbling about Adam Smith. So you're much more hip deep in this field than I am.
And usually after you do that, I'm usually sending you
Yeah.
5 to 10 page emails saying, Andrew, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which I like. I like that I've got I've got like my own little in-house think tank of people that go, okay, wait, I gotta interject here. So with you and your peers that are in actual trade and logistics, are you freaking out? Is this a situation where you're like, all right, let's let's all kind of keep our eyes peeled. Maybe we don't go crazy this year with Christmas bonuses. Are you all like, buying gold and Bitcoin and burying it in the backyard? Like what is the emotional state of people in trade?
Right now, a lot of it is because we've seen this record play before. Uh, we are very, very, we're going to be very, and I don't mean this from a political aspect, but we're going to start playing things very conservatively. I think that's the best way to say it. What you're going to see is less risk taken from the trade atmosphere. Now, when there's less risk, they teach us in business school, more risk, more reward, right? Very simple quantitative exclusion there. What this applies to from an economic standpoint, in my opinion, as somebody who has a minor in economics, when you look at companies becoming more and more conservative fiscally and being more concerned about these types of actions, you're going to see less investment. If you see less investment in things, that means you're more likely going to see less growth from the economy. I'm not going to say we're headed towards an economic slowdown because I'm not that smart. I will say I would not be surprised if we saw less investment across the economy from an international trade standpoint. I definitely think that there will be some direct impacts that affect certain countries and geographic areas, specifically China, I think we will see some ramifications for Russia, more so than what we've seen in the past. I think Iran is on alert from a military strategic standpoint, not necessarily a trade standpoint. But remember, any action that is taken, anything that affects the overall balance of trade impacts everybody. So, for example, the Houthis who just decided, hey, we're going to start shooting missiles at boats coming by in anywhere along the Yemeni area. That completely shut down trade. We can't go through it. First of all, you can, but you're going to pay through the nose with insurance costs. But we can't go through the Suez anymore. That has lengthened the supply chain by at least 2 weeks for goods going to the U.S. East Coast and to Europe. So that's why, if you have any European listeners, they already are feeling the price pinch on goods coming out of China to Europe because it's taking longer time, which means you have to have more vessels, which means there's more cost involved, more gas and more cost involved. And so as such, I think anything that can spook the market is going to spook the market for a short-term blip. What I'm worried about is long-term ramifications, and I don't think necessarily we're going to see I don't think we're going to see the Section 301 trade fees against China going away. In fact, because that investigation's already been done, quote unquote, I think they could potentially increase those fees without too much of a bother. I don't think they have to necessarily do anything there. So we're very, very, I don't want to say we're nervous, but we're going to be playing very conservative, probably over the next 2 years to see what happens. And that's not due to political appointments or anything like that. It's just based on the rhetoric that's been issued. We're very, very cautious going into it.
Okay. Final question for you, Jim. Well, two more questions.
Sure.
I'll let you answer them in the order that you want. Is there anything that we're missing from current discussions on tariffs and trade that you wish were part of the conversation that is not entering the conversation? If so, I open the floor to you. And then the other question will be, so what are cigars? How do the duty-free things work at the airport? What is that thing?
Okay. So,
and also, are they actually cheaper? Because I've got a theory that they're not. Because everything else is expensive at the airport. So why would it be if a sandwich costs me $20? How's a cigar going to be cheaper at the airport?
So I'll answer that one second.
Okay.
Because that's going to be slightly longer, but that's okay.
All right.
As far as trade goes, things that we're not talking about, I think what we need to do is have more transparency. We should be as citizens, we should be demanding more transparency from our government when it comes to what investigations are going on, when are they starting, what is the investigation actually looking into? Now, there are some ways they're going to say, well, these are national security. We can't tell you everything. That's fine. But I think we can demand, more information with regard to that. I think we also can demand to talk to, by talking to our representatives, writing our representatives and asking them specifically, we want you to be active with this. A lot of representatives, for the most part, want to stay away from anything trade related because they don't see it as directly impacting jobs unless it is a negative trade action uh, uh, against it, right? So I think we as citizens need to come back and go back to our representatives and push them into having these discussions and being more active with regard to it. Overall, that's from that standpoint. Duty-free stores. Okay.
Yeah.
So here's how duty-free stores work. They're predominantly set up kind of like a mini foreign trade zone.
Okay.
Goods can come in there. They aren't charged duty or anything else as long as they stay on let's just use an airport as an example, because you can have duty-free stores not in an airport, but that's the most common place you're going to see it.
Yeah.
They're not charged with duty as long as they stay in the airport area. As long as they're in that zone and area, as soon as you show your boarding pass that says, hey, I'm going to Scotland, right? They can sell you these goods because what they're doing is you're avoiding paying additional tax on them. So cigarettes, tobacco, alcohol, all the taxes and fees that not only the Customs Department, U.S. Customs and Border Protection picks up, but also the Internal Revenue Service, that's the one that collects all the alcohol tax, picks up. All that is ignored. But you are going to pay a premium because you're in a duty-free store and you're at the airport.
Mm-hmm.
What the theoretical goal is that when you go to the country that you're going into, you would then at that point have a what we call de minimis, a certain level of amount that you're allowed to bring in completely duty-free. So when I went to Ireland this past summer and came back, I came back with a lot of Irish whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
Not as much as I should have. Let me just put it that way. The way this election cycle went, I should have brought more Irish whiskey back with me. But I was allowed to bring up to 2 full. I'm trying to remember the exact limit, but I want to say it was like 2 100 milliliter bottles of Irish whiskey without paying duty on it, as long as the value of my total goods coming in was under $800. So because I could bring that in, I didn't have to pay the duty. I bought it in a duty-free store in Ireland, so I wasn't paying the EU tax. I wasn't paying the Irish VAT. I wasn't paying any of that. So when I came back into the US, I had all this stuff duty-free. Theoretically, that's cheaper. But I will tell you, having worked with duty-free stores in the past, they know this, and they take that into consideration when they price their goods.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So that's kind of my thought is maybe you're saving a little bit of, we're getting super practical, but this is what the, people could do what you're like theoretically, I'm going to buy a couple of bottles of scotch. Maybe I'm going to save like $5, but
Yes.
I now have to lug them through the airport with me and I have to make sure they don't break. It's probably not worth it to me.
Well, I will say this. That was the nice thing about going in and out of Dublin. I didn't have to lug it. I bought it in the duty-free store, and then they would literally put it in bags and they would meet me at the airplane and they would hand it to me on the airplane and I would bring it on board. And because I was flying a certain airline, which treats their business class customers very well, they would then take the duty-free item, put it into a special compartment, and then all I had to do was lug it from the airplane back to my home, which I would have to do that if I went to a store anyway. So it wasn't as bad. But still,
but all the same though, they know that because you're getting a reduction of 20%, that they can increase the cost by 18%. So
they won't go that high, but they'll go high, but they won't go that high because you can still buy the good.
You're saving a little bit of money, but not like a crazy amount,
right? Because in certain countries, and not in the U.S., but like in Europe, for example, you can buy if I'm trying to remember the number, but if it is over $60, I think I want to say it's 50 or 60 euros worth of items, and you buy them there, when you're at the airport, if you don't go to the duty-free store, let's say you've bought them there and you've paid the European VAT and whatever, when you get to the airport, you can go to a special VAT counter and file for a refund on it and get that VAT money back. So the duty-free store really isn't saving you much in Europe compared to everything else. But in the US, it's a huge deal. It's a huge, huge deal. Lots of people do. Specifically, tobacco, alcohol, and for whatever reason, cosmetics. I don't know why cosmetics are so darn expensive, but apparently they are.
Okay. All right, Jim, this has been so enlightening. Truly, I feel like I know oodles more than I previously did. I will be able to have coherent conversations with people when I'm sitting around and someone brings up trade and they're like, "Well, can the president even do that?" I'll be able to go, "Well, here's what the president can do and can't do." I am going to both be smarter and sound smarter. I am very grateful for you coming on. Would you like to direct anybody any particular direction? TheTradeNerd.com, I believe, is your website.
So thetradenerd.com is my website. You can also go to Logistics Haiku, where you can purchase my Logistics Haiku book, To Love Me or Not, Global Logistics Haiku's Views from the Inside. Yes, it's a haiku on the cover. I'm giving you one for free. Congratulations. This was actually, and in the foreword, I do specifically call out, and I'll read here verbatim. Having just read my friend Andrew Heaton's Los Angeles is Hideous, Poems About an Ugly City, I thought to myself, why not collect them together and try and put out a book for my people?
Nice.
So, inspired by your book, I have written a book of my own. And so if you feel like you want to spend $1 on Amazon, it's logisticshaikus.com. You can find it there, or you can just send me $1. I can take $1 too. Or the best way to get a hold of me is the Discord, because I'm there.
Wonderful. Well, then I will make a note to put a link into the Discord. I think if you go to mightyheaton.com/Discord, I believe it will take you directly there. Occasionally I have to refresh that link, but it should work. So if you would like to talk to Jim and other people that listen to the program, you can go to mightyheaton.com/Discord. I don't know how many people will buy Logistics Haikus, but I promise you this, Jim, at least one person will buy Logistic Haikus. I'm confident. Like, this is probably, other than Davos, this is probably ground zero for people that would buy it. And I'm also confident there's at least one person listening right now. There's at least one person who's going, I think my dad would actually really like that for Christmas. So I think you'll get some amount of sales from that.
For $1, you can buy the Kindle book, and obviously for $1, I'm not making money on it. I just did it for an effort to say that, hey, you too can be an author, just like my friend Andrew Heaton.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jim, you were my favorite trade expert and trade poet, and so I thank you very much. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hey, gang. I want to thank everyone who's bought a copy of my new book, Tribalism is Dumb. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope that it's helped make sense of our current partisan landscape a bit more, and likewise, I hope that it makes your holidays a little bit less prone to breaking plates and divorce. If you've purchased the book, and again, you have my incredible thanks, but if you've purchased the book, I'm going to prevail upon you to do one more thing. You would do a very big solid for me if you went on Amazon or Audible to review it. Here's the deal. Phase 1 was publish a book on why partisanship is bad and where it comes from, and do that at the absolute peak of partisan madness over the last 4 years. Now, I knew you, dear listener, I knew you, the independent thinking political orphan, you would appreciate it. But all the people swept up in red team versus blue team who are locked in teeter-totter thinking, where if you say something about Trump, you have to be saying something good about the Democrats. If you say something good about the Democrats, it has to be negative about the Republicans. All those people that perceive of everything as a proxy war for red and blue, they were not super interested in purchasing a book on tribalism just before an election. And that's fine. Because phase 2, which begins next year, is when I start making the push for everybody else. And to do that, I need your help. It's much, much easier for me to get booked on shows and talk about tribalism and bring up the book if producers can look at tribalism as dumb and go, oh, look, all these people are reading it. This is a thing. This is something worth discussing. At present, there are 48 reviews on Amazon, and if we could just get that number up to 100, and I'm confident we can because far more people than that have actually purchased the book, if I can get that number above 100, that is a signal to producers that it's worth looking at, that actual people are reading it. It's not just 6 people that are friends with me that decided to buy it. And then I can go on shows and maybe, just maybe, get people to think a little bit harder in general and a little softer specifically on partisan shenanigans. So again, thank you for buying Tribalism is Dumb. If you haven't taken a look yet, I think you'll like it. And for those of you that have, I would be very grateful if you would go on Amazon or Audible and review it. Thank you. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Big Jim Thatcher, for coming on to fill us in on trade. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's episode. And thank you, patrons who make it all possible. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heath, and so have you.